Welcome to the Voices in Recovery podcast. Voices in Recovery is produced by Freedom's Path Recovery Society, a registered Canadian charity. If you enjoy the podcast, please consider a donation at www.freedomspathrecoverysociety.ca. All donations go directly to assisting Freedom's Path in providing services free of charge and helps us keep the podcast going. We are grateful for any and all donations. This podcast discusses difficult topics such as childhood abuse, drug and alcohol use, sexuality, sexualized trauma, and more. If you are under the age of 18, please speak with your legal guardian prior to listening. The opinions expressed during the podcast are those of the individual and not those of Voices in Recovery or Freedom's Path Recovery Society. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the podcast.
This podcast is being recorded on the traditional land of the Blackfoot Confederacy. This consists of the Kainai, Piikani, Siksika, and the Blackfeet in the U.S. We acknowledge the Stoney Nakoda, which consists of the Bearspaw, Morley, and Chiniki. We acknowledge the Tsuut'ina Huardene and the Métis, Inuit, status and non-status from all of Turtle Island, and those who are visiting. We are all treaty people.
So for today, it's 20 years sober this week for me. And I wanted to, I don't know, I wanted to come on and talk to my friends about that and about other things that have been going on over the last year. And so I really appreciate you joining us, Michelle and Darcy. Just before we keep going, Darcy's having technical issues. So
yeah, my video's not working great, so it might go. I might turn it off. So,
and that's okay. Yeah. So Darcy might jump out of the video. But Michelle, how are you doing? And thank you for joining us.
Well, first of all, congratulations on your sober anniversary. It's such a big one. You. We're so happy for you. And, at the end of the day, that's you doing a lot of work over a lot of years. And it's not fun. It's not easy. And I just wanted to say congratulations.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah. And it isn't, you're right. It's not easy and it's not always fun, No. And the last 4 years have been, I'll even say 4.5 now, years have just been, holy crap, like learning about myself, about like white culture, settler culture, colonialization, like this, it almost feels like I've been to university for the last 4 years, like getting like a real education finally about like, well, how things really work, right? And I'm not going to lie, it's been like painful. And I know we've talked about this through the year many times, you and I, in terms of just how dark it can really get still, in this year of 2024 where people are like, oh, we're so far ahead. Maybe our technology is far ahead, but that might be all, right?
And let's set that stage right now, because right now we're months after October 7th. So there's been a massive change and rise in a conversation about Israel and Palestine. What that looks like in our education systems, like the institutions, how they've been going after pro-Palestinian camps and targeting people and saying, as a default, I feel unsafe. And so, whereas folks like me who actually have been unsafe have been voicing this for years, and now they're appropriating that narrative. And why it's relevant is that we're days away from the Calgary Pride, and you as a newly out person talking about different things, you're seeing how now even the political pride parades are being even more political, with statements for or against these Palestinian camps, and boycotting and divesting and transparency over who's invested into Israeli arms, etc. Like, it's a heavy moment right now to celebrate your sober anniversary.
Yeah, you're right. And I mean, you mentioned this, and pride is one of those things I really wanted to talk about, right? Because it's important to me. I value the Pride Parade. I've learned so much by having gone a few years in a row, and now I haven't gone for a couple of years in a row, based on some political stuff. But frankly, like, that's kind of where yeah, my brain has been turning this stuff over, right? It's like, okay, so we know that like police organizations are shitty. We know that they're systemically racist now. So we know that the organizations are racist. And I say this very humbly because it's not like you didn't know before us, right? It's like, so there's those of us who were like, you know, kind of right along neck and neck with these organizations in some cases. And so it was really impossible for us to see it. And they make it impossible when you're on the inside, right? Because they either ridicule you into conformity or they ridicule you into conformity. And or you leave. Like there's only one choice, right? And so for some of us, we decided to leave. And I think I mentioned police in terms of pride because I know that's one of the sticking points for some folks, and I appreciate it, right? Like I appreciate that that's a sticking point. I think what I've tried to bring back nuance into my thinking about these things because I know for a while here I've just been expressing my anger. Because I've never done it before. I've never fully expressed that full range of emotion when it comes to like law enforcement or the churches or stuff like that. These things that I've carried with me for years since being a part of those organizations. But the reality is like I don't know what people should or shouldn't support. I really don't. I don't know that the Pride Parade could happen without any corporate sponsorship. I don't know if that's possible. I imagine it is, right? If we acted like a community, it would be very possible, right? I think part of what I see is this decisiveness, but amongst us all within small communities, but then within the larger community as well, because we have obviously there's a lot of intersectionality, right? So we're discovering this intersectionality, and I've been having a real hard time because I was raised not to cut people off. Do you know what I mean? I was always raised to give people a chance. And so even if nobody else gives them a chance, that's what I was raised to try to do. And so that includes, unfortunately, that has included the police and other people who aren't necessarily potentially in thinking of along things in the same line as me or you, right? Like, and of course, what are we supposed to do when we determine, okay, so we have this pride organization that has historically been racist. Like we know that it has historically been this way, okay? And I believe it. I haven't experienced it, but I'm not a racialized human. So I believe what folks have gone through is true. And so, but is Pride now trying to rectify that? Like, are they doing things in their own organization in order to address and then obviously do something about their racism? Like, have they made these intentions? Have they even tried anything? I honestly don't know. And so, in lieu of knowing, it's hard for me to get really mad about stuff. And also, Michelle, between you and I, are there any large corporations that aren't invested in Israel? Like, are there? Especially in Western society, right? Because Israel has always been our uncle, right? They've been our crazy uncle, like the uncle that even when I was a young kid growing up in LA, we were worried, right, about that uncle because he always seemed to be rattling his swords, you know. And so now here we are. We have all kinds of reasons for people not to support Pride. And what I think about though is there's all kinds of reasons for people not to support anything now, right? Because if you go to your bank and everyone has to have a bank account, I'm sorry, I wish we didn't. Like, but what are we supposed to do, right? Like, so in lieu of burning everything down and shit canning everything, how do we? And I know there's going to be arguments about me being a moderate white man, right? And I know what that looks like. I understand the position that moderate white folks have held back movements for years. I get that. And I totally believe that. It makes sense to me. I just don't know how to not be moderate about some things, I guess, right? Because I was taught to be moderate. So like I was taught to try to help everyone, not just one side over another. And so that comes into conflict. Great conflict, right?
I'm going to tell you as a mother of a queerling, I'm struggling this year because I, of course, support the organization, the Indigenous organization they're a part of. I want to see them have fun. I do support the choosing of who the parade marshals were. The parade marshals being trans folks and a trans organization that does incredible work here in Alberta in supporting the trans community, and run by a white mom and a person who, like, I love her. I think that she is a trans mom trying to do the best she can for not just her own, but for the entire community. And to see one of our trans friends, being promoted alongside, who's done advocacy for trans people for like decades, forever. These are people, of course, I support and I want to elevate. We would see that there is no person of color there right now. And honestly, I do think that there needs to be a conversation that, how do you say this, where I know many white people see themselves, and many settlers see themselves as, marginalized people, and they are. However, as white people, they do have a level of institutional privilege in every realm of life, including work, including business. In my podcast,
100%.
I reference the Calgary Foundation's stats about how BIPOC people can't find meaningful work because we are in a very racist society where we lose our jobs disproportionately more than white people, etc. So, there is a lot to be said about the fact that the most marginalized people aren't at the front because, at the end of the day, we live in such a white, racist, supremacist society of settler colonialism. And so, of course, we're seeing, it's been 4 years since the Black Lives Matter movement talked about anti-racism. Offensive to me as a person who has been talking about anti-racism work since long before that. And we had a commission that came out with calls to action and inquiry with calls to justice that people ignored. I see racism regularly during prides, especially, without including the two.
Would you mind? I
Sure.
don't mean to interrupt you, Michelle. Would you mind talking about the calls to action, the calls to justice, what the difference is between them? I've read them, but not very many folks that look like me have read them.
Yeah,
And that
I
becomes
know.
apparent when I talk to them, but
Sure. So for folks who don't know, we've had many different commissions and inquiries in Canada to talk about Indigenous issues. In 1996, we had the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. So a lot of us reference RCAP, and there was over 400 recommendations in that. So when the Truth and Reconciliation Commissioners put together the final report for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that came out in 2015, so we're coming up on the 10-year anniversary. When that came out, we had 94 calls to action. And the commissioners purposely called them calls to action because the RCAP had recommendations, which were never followed nor instituted. And they wanted to narrow it down from over 400 to 94. Now, that was a little easier in the sense that this was specific to Indian residential school policy, whereas RCAP was way more encompassing about, treaty and governance and
way more general.
Way bigger.
Okay.
So of course it's going to have far more recommendations as well, because they're talking about far bigger, broader issues, and especially when it comes to governance, treaty, and settler colonialism. And then fast forward to 2019, we had the National Inquiry's final report come out. They had a preliminary report with calls to justice as well. And they purposely called them calls to justice because they wanted, like, the calls to action to be implemented, not to sit on a shelf and collect dust. And they had over 231 of them. And embedded in every single one of those calls to justice is the intersectionality of understanding gender diversity. So I can always tell when the queer community has not fully read or understood neither the calls to action or the calls to justice, because the liberation of the queer community is also in that national inquiry report for folks who would take the time to read it. And both the TRC and the National Inquiry, they're volumes. And I've read them along with people in my book club to really make sure people understand the gravity of what they are. And so, these are things that matter to me, but I see regularly in the queer community, folks who don't understand their treaty partners, don't see the Two-Spirit as the founders of the queer community on these soils. And we have solutions that would help everybody, not just Indigenous people. And the problem with Canada is they always see this as an Indigenous issue, and it's not. They need to start seeing themselves as treaty partners in a settler colonial country that was made up. And as a result, they have obligations to a treaty, which they choose to ignore. And our education chooses not to educate others on it.
Well, and thank you for that. Thank you for that description. And honestly, we can ignore it because it's never been taught to us. Like, they're not going to put the calls to justice or calls to action in a course, right? Unless you specifically go looking for it. And then of course you have, and this brings up a lot of things, like, do people even know? That's the first question. And then of course, because the calls to justice and calls to action, for some people, they just get brought up in a very general way and folks don't really understand. Like, I would wager a guess that there's folks in the queer community who have no idea that it even talks about us in there. Right?
Yeah, I've met some newer organizations that are, basically newcomers, and newcomers aren't taught, even under the Rainbow Railway umbrella that I advocated for, we now have in Calgary. We don't teach them. We don't teach them that they're, part of a settler colonial state, that they are treaty partners, they have obligations, and that the Two-Spirit are the first queers here. So these are things that we need to be teaching the new queerlings that come to Canada, and that we can, work together in solidarity. And, I am always shocked at the lack of teachings and how many people have crossed my path. And what I tell people though, is that it's that old expression, you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make them drink it.
Yeah.
It's not from a lack of you and I bringing a horse to the water, really.
No, for sure. It's not. Yeah.
It is quite willful for folks to choose not to know these issues at this point.
What I find interesting, is that
go ahead, man.
When it comes to these things, it's everybody sees it as, oh, that's an Indigenous report. That's about Indigenous people. But the truth is it affects everybody. So anybody that's in a group that, like, if you're a woman, all of those recommendations help you, because it helps you get equal pay. It helps you get equal everything. Like, these things are about equality, and it's not just equality for Indigenous people. If we started implementing these on a business level, on a community level, on a community, like the community center level, all of these levels on top of government and everything else, everybody's lives would be affected in a positive way. Anybody that feels is under any type of oppression or, anything like that would benefit from these calls to actions, these, things like that. So that's what I always find interesting is if people read it and tried to stop thinking about just Indigenous people, they'd realize that actually affects so many Canadians and would make life a lot better if we all started trying to implement them on those levels. So,
and I think that's important. Thanks for mentioning it. It's like, I know that some people need extra incentive, right, to learn stuff. And like that's like an extra incentive. If you really feel like you're one of those folks who needs to like relate directly to what's happening in order to feel like you can do something about it, this is it, right? Like, you can find out this is about more than just Indigenous folks. Although, from my perspective, that should be plenty enough for us to like pay attention, right? But again, I'm not the world at large. I am blessed to have like close friends who have like been like yourselves, amazing, right? But I have to imagine folks without that kind of, I'll call it a privilege, right? Because I am kind of privileged to be able to be a part of your family and have you a part of mine. Like, that stuff is a privilege. But at the same time, it requires like work, right? Like, it requires work to maintain that kind of those friendships. Like, and I don't know that everybody else has that opportunity. I wish it didn't equal that, right? Like, I wish there was just this, we could just wake up one day, but it didn't happen for me like that. So why would it happen for someone else, right? It's not like you just wake up and be like, oh, that's right. We are all one human race, right? Like this does make sense. But again, it's kind of like you have to be shocked into it in a little bit. And especially like one of the things you mentioned about the treaties and how we are treaty partners, that kind of stuff doesn't occur to us. Like we didn't know we were treaty partners. Like we think of the treaties like they're past, right? Like that's where what we were taught. We were taught to treat these happened long ago. They have nothing to do with us. It's not our responsibility what our elders, what our ancestors did, right? Like, but this is how, in my mind, this is the real truth and reconciliation. Is when, like, first of all, down in California, gave some land back to some of the nations on the coast. That is real reconciliation to me. It's not just about giving money, it's about giving back the land because that's what we fucking took. Right? And I mean, down in California, they're aware, and don't get me wrong, I know California has its issues. I don't want to get in the political side of things with California because I know I have friends from down there who are probably right now, when they're listening, thinking, what a fucking guy. He has no idea how bad it is in California. Okay, that's great. But if it takes that for a state government or a provincial government or a federal government to recognize that, hey, maybe the original stewards of the land would do a better job than us. Like maybe they won't like lay waste to the salmon population. Like, do you know what I mean? Maybe they'll actually help. and to me, that's reconciliation, right? Truth and you recognize the truth. We stole your land. How do we reconcile that? We give some back.
I think right? I better bring up two things real quick here before I forget my ADHD brain. So in the States, it's starting to come out, your Indian boarding schools. And like as Indigenous people, we always knew, we've talked about it for decades. We've talked about the problems of Indian boarding schools. And actually, Darcy's been directly impacted by Indian boarding schools as well. So this is coming out. And basically the TRC that we had up north is going to be happening down south here very shortly. And I think it's about time Americans really understood the gravity of their, settler colonialism. There's no nice way to say it. And that movie that just came out about Flowers of the Moon, like that that movie, I think is starting to help people understand the gravity of what really happened there. Now, as Indigenous people, we wish it was through the lens of an Indigenous storyteller as opposed to Martin Scorsese or however you say his name. But at the end of the day, at least there's some understanding a little better of settler colonialism there and the policies that really ended up in the murder of our people. But up north here, we've also given some land back on the coast in Vancouver as well. And there's a little bit more of that is starting to happen. But what I really want to bring up, especially to my settler colonial folks listening here, whether you're from Africa and you newly immigrated, or whether you're from from Europe and newly immigrated, or consider yourself, a third generation Canadian or American. When we start talking about land back, they get really scared. And the reason why they get scared is because they think I'm going to come into their house and take their house and be like, this is my house now. And that's not how it works. So rather than folks getting all afraid and being like, we're going to have to go to war over this, just calm the hell down and listen. So
they just assume that folks will be like we are.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly, I'm not coming in and burning your babies. I'm not going to come in and steal your babies. I'm not going to go over to Europe, change your laws and make you all learn Dene. I'm not going to do that. I want people to be very aware, especially in Canada, 80% of the land is so-called crown land. So in like 100% of the land is treaty land and Indigenous land, 100%. If we followed the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, all that would happen is that people would have to start giving their governance to Indigenous people letting Indigenous people do the governance. And you'd be surprised to find out our governance doesn't exclude people like settler colonial governance does. So, we had over 700 nations just alone here in Canada. So rather than there being this municipal, provincial, federal, like, start seeing people in a very different way in that sense, right? People aren't willing to even entertain this thought. But I just want to make it really clear that, we're not going to be kicking people out, because that would be kicking out my dad. That would be kicking out, my half brother, my stepmom. We're not kicking out people. We're not saying that. But kind of back to what you alluded to for folks in California, that maybe Indigenous people have a better idea of how to handle climate change. Maybe Indigenous people have a better idea on stewardship of the land. Just maybe it would be worthwhile if our water and our air quality and our quality of life is going down so substantially. Just maybe it would be worthwhile to allow us to have some, voice at the table. Imagine if we had equity. Imagine what could happen. A lot of things would change. And it is really sad that most people will side with a billionaire rather than understand that they have way more in common with somebody who's homeless, because we are homeless because of settler colonialism, because of land theft, because of government policies that have imposed systemic poverty. Like, why would you choose that? Because now you're all feeling it. And now we're like, yeah, welcome to the club. We have cookies, and we can help help you with understanding what's going on.
Well, I think it's interesting because everything, like, people fight against Indigenous so hard. They bring out, the RCP special teams and snipers and everything. But when you actually, like, what are they protesting a lot of times? And it's like clean water. Like Dave said, saving salmon spawning grounds. Like, it's things like that, clean soil, naturally harvesting, not decimating, ecosystems. Who does that benefit? Everyone. It literally benefits everyone. You like to eat salmon? Then you probably are going to have a place where they can get spawned. And if they don't, you're not going to have salmon anymore. Like, these are very simple concepts, but it's like Michelle said, let's side with the billionaire class, because that world conglomerate that does all the salmon canning, that, is overfishing the waters, they're fine. If they're taking out 10 times more than what the rivers and lakes or wherever can actually handle, that's fine. Let's decimate that. But actually managing it, we can't do that. Like, let's, and then that's where the racism comes in, because they've done a good job of building it up. Like, the Indigenous only want it for themselves, and everybody else can starve and die. And it's like, it's never been that way. Never throughout history in Canada. So
that's
why
very
would it
settler.
now?
That's very colonial of us to believe that other people are just like us, and that would step on their own grandmother to make $1.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Like, no, that's very much colonialism, right? Yeah. I think, dude, I agree. I think, like, it's just so tricky to convince people that they are partners and a part of this, right? Because they've been told for so long, this was their ancestor stuff, man. There's nothing we can do about it.
Yeah.
But there's just lots of stuff that we need to do about it. And I think, like, one of the things I wanted to talk about as well for 20 years of sobriety is this, like, how wrong I've been so many times, like, through the 20 years. Like, I mean, obviously I'm coming up on 50 years old next month, but that's another story for another day. But it's been like, it's literally been a learning curve that, man, I don't know. I don't wish it on anybody, in terms of some of the stuff that you have to go through when you sober up. But at the same time, if there's something to it, because there's something to that pain and that crucible of pain that does help you as you get older and longer in your sobriety, where you don't need as much dogma, but what you really need is, like, truth, right? And I think it's part of why truth and reconciliation sits so high in my mind, because I know that without the truth, I can't move forward. And it's not just about that one thing, but about so many things,
Let's
that.
unpack that a bit more. All three of us went and took some sobriety training. You both have Mending Broken Hearts under your belt. I have it as well, but you both have the 12-step program under the sobriety umbrella. And at the end of the day, it is the first place to allow conversation about colonial trauma. And because it's one of those places that allowed us to have that conversation of like, hey, guess what? It sucked when I was abused at Indian residential school. Hey, guess what? It sucked when I had to leave it and go home and my family didn't speak English. And it really sucked when I went home and, my grandparents weren't there because they had passed and I didn't know. And it really sucked when the government scooped us. And it really sucked when I tried to reconnect with my community, and it really sucked. And so we have all these levels of colonial trauma of like, trying to deal with homeless shelters, trying to deal with police, trying to deal with different orders of government, regular racism that we experience every single day by the average Joe Canadian. And, this builds up. And it's no wonder that there's so much trauma that we have to acknowledge, so much truth. Now, I'm in counseling, and I've been in counseling my entire life, from court ordered to voluntary. And I'll tell you, only in the last maybe 5 years have some, not all, but a few of the white counselors understood the gravity. And I don't think they'll ever fully understand, as you so eloquently said earlier. But, there's at least an understanding that, oh my God, my government may have lied to me, maybe about a few different things. Oh my God. And so as a result, they're going through this as well as you. And to be frank, to all Canadians, anyone listening to this, all Canadian kids, they get it. They're being born and raised in this. So while it may be a shock to some adults, and myself included, and when I start reading some of these books that we have for our book club and unpacking the gravity of some of the governmental policies that were imposed on our people, holy Hannah. And that intergenerational wealth that settlers have, that they are so oblivious to. They have no concept that the infrastructure that we see in every capacity benefits them only.
Yeah.
So, we're talking about a lot of trauma. We are talking about a lot of truth. And that truth is being taught now to our children through people who are willing to do those learnings. Again, you can't force a horse to drink water. So, our kids are like, how do we make this better? Knowing Gen X and baby boomers were not telling the truth this entire time, and the generations before that to the younglings. So now all of our younglings are looking at us like, how? And why are you still apprehending babies? So there's a lot of conversations and policy changes that have to be taking place. And most Canadians are so oblivious. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think, and they're probably oblivious for lots of reasons, because I'm definitely not going to be defending anyone who's oblivious. However, I will say that, like, not being told does play a part, right? And then when you're being told as an adult, it is much more difficult to believe the truth than it is to rely on the old lie you were told, right? And I get that. I mean, that is probably, in terms of me as a social worker or a helping person, that is what we want. We want hope, right? We want there to be hope that we're going to be able to see the truth. And of course, the left and the right fuck up everybody, right? If you're not able to see the nuance and the necessity of those far extremes, because what I see is those far extremes, and this may out me as a fucking moderate human in some ways. I'm not moderate when it comes to anti-racism. I'm not moderate when it comes to genocide. But there are some things where I find my brain is like very reasonable about it and tries to figure out, okay, what is the actual right thing to do here, right? So like, is it in my world, coming up with bumping into people who look like me, who don't think like me, that's for sure, but they look like me. And that becomes very challenging, right? Because I've always been kind of the just go along and get along with this stuff, and don't participate if it's something that is beyond you to participate in. However, I'm finding it really tough to just like not participate because I'm starting to realize from the books that I've read, some that you've suggested, some that Taylor McNally suggested, and those books have absolutely changed my mind.
Yeah.
And it's not like they had to bludgeon me to death and tell me I was a shitty person to change my mind. No, as a matter of fact, most of it's about love, about trying to find a way to love each other, right? But in order to do that, I have to understand that, like, growing up, I acted like a racist at times. I have to realize that that's real in my past, and I know now that it is. Like I look back and I see not all of them, of course, because I'm almost 50. So chances are I've made lots of decisions in my life that I have no idea what they were based on, because I was an emotional kid and I made lots of choices. But what I'm getting at is it's not going to serve me moving forward if I pretend like I was never racist. Like, yeah. And don't get me wrong, out there in wherever you might be, I do not want to be racist. I do not want to acknowledge that I'm racist. But the truth is, I have been. I have acted out of my biases, and that is pretty much similar to just being racist, right? I've acted out of privilege. I've taken advantage of my privilege. I've done these kinds of things. And so, like, I'm not trying to tell anybody I'm squeaky clean, because I'll tell you what, I'm not squeaky clean. But what I am trying to say is that no matter how dirty we might be, we can still figure this stuff out and not have to stay there. I don't know if that makes any sense.
I think it makes great sense, because I think it's interesting. We're talking, it's your 20th, year of sobriety. And I mean, that's a huge change. You had to unlearn what you were doing.
Well, fuck yeah.
To be sober, right? You had to break down those walls. And I feel like that's kind of what a lot of people do when they start to realize that Canada is a racist place, that Canada does have racism. Because I'll be honest, I grew up, I drank the Kool-Aid 100%. I was like, Canada, racism? What are you talking about? But I think that's the thing, is at some point you have your eyes opened. And I don't know if it's on the same scale as something as impactful as, sobriety. But I do think it is a moment where you start to realize what you've been doing or how you've been acting, or your, like you said, your biases, all these things. You start to really examine those. And I think it's no different than when you go into sobriety. What do you have to start to do? Examine why you're drinking or using substances or eating or whatever your addiction is. Yeah. So you have to unpack that. Well, it's no different as adults when it comes to this kind of stuff. Racism, sexism, just hate in general. Is you got to walk away going, hi, geez, man, I got to really think about this. And I know for me, it took years. It took a number of years before and I wouldn't even say that I'm not racist now. I just, I think I'm more aware of my biases, like you said. I literally have, a few years ago, even I caught myself locking the car doors when a certain person walked by on the street, or turning the music down, just like the stupid movie Office Space, right? Like it.
Oh my God, that's hilarious. But
it's hilarious, but it's so true. And there's only a certain segment of the population that's really going to experience that and understand what that is. So I just think it's a really it's kind of an evolution of just people being, like in your case, being sober. As you grow in sobriety, you're naturally going to, okay, I've examined that thing 1,000 times. I think I can move on to this next thing now. And it's that, for lack of a better word, it's that stepping up of understanding who you are and understanding, do I really want to be this person? Because I don't want to use substances now. I want to be clean, but I also don't want to be an asshole. And I think that's a natural progression.
Yeah. And that's interesting, Darcy, because you mentioned sobriety, like sobering up. For most of us who sober up, whether we stay sober or not, but for most of us who sober up at any given time, there's some sort of catalyst, right? So there's just like with this learning, there has to be a catalyst for people. And that could be as simple as recognizing that you have been, in fact, racist at times, or that you have been, in fact, acting out of privilege at times. That's not for someone else to say to you, much like alcoholism. I could never tell someone else they're an alcoholic. I would never. I don't feel comfortable enough to ever put that label on someone. They can do it themselves. And that's kind of like where that changes again, right? It's like, well, what's the catalyst going to be? And if it's not, like as you mentioned, there have been some major catalysts for people to pay attention to in terms of racism across North America.
Yeah.
And we're just talking about North America. I'm not going to talk about other countries because I haven't spent enough time there. Obviously, we know that within every country and every system, there is a systemic racism that holds down a certain percentage of their population, whether that's the indigenous population of that land or someone else who they figure out they don't like, right? Like whether it's the hierarchy in a country where if you're brown, you're obviously less than because you're a farmer. But if you're not as brown, you're not as, do you know what I'm saying? Like I've heard these stories come out of other countries where there's a hierarchy of brownness, right? And that is white supremacy. That is white supremacy creeping into those other places. And of course, it's colonialization. I mean, obviously, we know that's a part and parcel to white supremacy, to spreading that message that if you were darker, you are worse than, right? And I wish, this is the catalyst I'm wishing for, is that that some of folks that look like me could actually see that, right? And be like, oh my God, this is all connected to hating darkness, right? Like to wanting everyone to look like us. And so that we don't have to be afraid or whatever it is that people think. And that, I don't know, man, that the catalyst for drinking was not being able to work anymore or potentially going to die from like liver failure, or those are catalysts that all the time get people to quit drinking. What are some catalysts? Because I mean, if George Floyd being murdered in front of our face doesn't open the eyes up of people, then I don't know what will. And then if to follow George Floyd being murdered right in front of our face, we see a white kid walking down the street with a machine gun. Nothing happens to that white kid. This is problematic. But of course, everyone forgot about that kid, right? Everyone forgot that not only was he not squashed by police, he was not shot. He was not, like, I don't even know if he's in prison. Like, I imagine he's doing some prison time, but I'm not sure, because it wouldn't surprise me if he wasn't. It wouldn't surprise me if they cut a deal because his dad knew a lawyer or knew a judge, because like whether people like to admit it or not, that does happen. And it does happen even here in Canada. I have examples of where Canadian judges have tried to exert their, I'm not going to say them on this podcast, but there's examples where Canadian judges, even in Alberta, have tried to manipulate police in terms of investigations. And so to know that that happens, and then to have people say, oh no, the police would never do that. It's like, you really need to give your head a shake, because these are those catalyst moments, just like being a fall down drunk like I was 20 years ago. The catalyst for me was being a fall down drunk. I couldn't get drunk enough. I didn't enjoy it. I hated it at that point, even though I was spent so much money on booze and morphine, none of it worked. But like whatever the catalyst is, I don't know what we're going to need for our, I guess, I mean, maybe the catalyst is going to be something catastrophic in order to shift the whole perspective. Maybe that's what we need, some sort of catastrophic, I guess, intervention.
Yeah, could be.
Yeah, I don't know, man. Like, but you bring up a good point, right? Like, but what's the, like, for every alcoholic that I've ever met who has sobered up for any amount of time, we have a catalyst. There's something in our story that has helped us decide to change something, right? And I think there's just still this like, and I wish it wasn't this way. I just sense this like anti-Indigenous hate in the world, not just in Canada, but Canada has it by the short and curlies, because Canada has been an apartheid state for so long that it's been so long that Canadians don't even recognize it as an apartheid state, right? And that to me is troubling.
Yeah, we're the OG of it, actually. We taught
exactly.
We taught it to South Africa.
We inspired others.
Yeah.
Well, and
we
that's
inspired Hitler.
That's right. We inspired so many, and of course, nobody wants to acknowledge that. Yeah. But I mean, that's where South Africa got the idea for apartheid, was from us, and that doesn't just come out of nowhere. That's because we have a system that is systemically racist towards anyone not like settler, Christian, whatever, and predominantly white, right? And so those have been things that, I mean, this last year, like Michelle, you mentioned it, just because all of a sudden I'm able to see how corrupt and violent the police really are and that they really want to be. I just saw that this year. You've known it forever. And
I'm going to actually talk. First, I'm going to give a shout out to Taylor McNally. We mentioned her a little sooner. For folks who may not know, she's the Black Lives Matter Calgary leader, I would say, same along with Adora Nofor. And the two of them have unfortunately had many charges stacked against them. There's something called Stop the Stack YYC, and I encourage folks to learn more about that. It's interesting. Darcy and I, we grew up watching Rodney King. We grew up listening to NWA, and he had, a friend that really helped educate us on anti-Blackness. And it is sad. I can say I'm still learning on how to undo my anti-Blackness biases that has been taught by this society in its white supremacist culture. And I also thought it was really important for Darcy and I to talk about something that, folks may not understand. I was born in Calgary here. And, when my parents were first in a domestic violence situation, because my mom was Native and my dad was white. And at that time, it was like, late 70s, early 80s. There wasn't even a single women's shelter. There wasn't one for Indigenous people for sure. And at that time, the Calgary police did not care about domestic violence. So anyway, when my parents finally split,
when half the service is under investigation for domestic violence, it makes it tough for them to try to convict people, right?
Yes. For folks who are interested in learning about the first women's shelter in Calgary, a wonderful book I have called Jawbreaker. And I think it would be really important for people to understand how recent shelters are in, urban centers like Calgary and the attitude that police had then. But both Darcy and I, we actually grew up in Sylvan Lake. And for folks who may not know, Sylvan Lake is like this. At that time, there were not that many RCMP. There was a very small detachment, and their area that they had to surveil went way into the Rocky Mountain House area, up trunk roads. And so they would have to do patrols and deal with all sorts of things, like hundreds of kilometers away from just Sylvan Lake. So in the summer, the RCMP would send in, the fresh new recruits that came out of Regina, and literally made the local teens and kids' lives a living hell. So both Darcy and I had that experience in Sylvan Lake and knew not to trust RCMP then. So, and obviously I don't want to speak for Darcy and his experiences, but like we have never had positive interactions with police. And we were born and raised here. And, Darcy comes from two different families in the Rocky Mountain House area. And that, one being settler colonial and being very strong at having privilege. And yet, we still experience that type of behavior from the police. So, it's not something that is new to me. And when I heard the stories of other Indigenous people, like we've had, there was something called the Beowulf report here that actually led to the creation of the Blood Tribe Police and the Tsuut'ina Police after a woman and her young child were shot by the RCMP at Tsuut'ina. So it is really important to understand like the history of policing in Canada. Obviously, they were brought in to clear the plains of natives so that settlers could come in, So
and they're still doing that.
100%. And in fact, we have had far more shootings of BIPOC people in Canada this year already than previous years. And so I wish people understood the gravity. Like right now, there is no accountability. If I get shot and killed today or my daughter, nobody's going to care because I'm a Native. And that's not okay. There should be equity.
And the investigation goes to ACERT in Alberta, which is just a bunch of corrupt police on the panel of ACER. So however you get selected for ACER, I'm not going to pretend to know, except I imagine it's because you're friends with somebody and you probably attend the same clan rallies. Like this, it's so diabolical, right? And then to try to turn around and tell people, no, you're making it up. Like, this is not the way our system is. It's like, no wonder there's no end to the trauma, right? Like that, there's just no end to it.
And it's not like it's not well documented, right? So
exactly.
We have multiple reports about it. We have multiple recommendations, calls to justice, calls to action. And yet this isn't part of this conversation of investment in policing.
Yeah, I just want to kind of follow up because you mentioned Taylor and Adora, and I find them to be absolutely amazing. Also necessary, right? Like, and I get it. Some people have a hard time listening to folks who are angry and do all that stuff. I don't really have that hard time anymore because especially if you're angry and you have a point, especially if you're angry and you're telling the truth. Like, I don't know. And to say, just to carry on to that, like, I don't have to agree with everything Adora and Taylor might say for me to not only respect and admire them, but to also support them, right? Because what they are saying is necessary, regardless of whether I agree or not. How those things can happen, I don't know. I'm not.
But I think you come from a trauma-informed lens. So, like, for a lot of folks who may not know, you see the trauma. You don't see the action and words as anger. You see the trauma coming from it. And I think, again, this comes down rooted deeply in your sobriety understandings. You see trauma in your colleagues, your peers, and folks that, you've had to go on this journey with, and you don't necessarily see it as, someone being angry the way, white supremacy in the media has taught us to believe of the darker your skin, and it's never saying that anger is justified.
Yeah, because it is. Like, it's so justified, right? Like, I mean, in my mind, if every Indigenous person decided to burn down churches across Canada, I would be like, man, that's intense, but I understand. Like, that would be a direct expression of that anger that I would believe most people have towards the church, especially in terms of the suffering, right? Yeah. However, like the church, much like law enforcement, much like RCMP, like, and I know people are like, oh, they're not the same. I'm like, yeah, they fucking are. Because if the Roman Catholic Church was able to have an army, they'd look much like the RCMP, right? Like, and I know they probably do have an army, the Catholic Church. That's why I say if they do, because they probably have a secret army, because they have enough money to do that. And they have enough power and enough privilege and enough like scope of control on this planet to kind of have that.
And to be very clear, the Vatican does. They do have their own policing. Yeah.
Yeah. I was almost certain of it. I didn't know for sure, but thank you for saying that.
I think the thing when you look at like churches and stuff and their tax shelters, their all these things, but like if you're running an organization that doesn't have any literal skeletons in the closet, why do you need so much government protection? Why do you need the Prime Minister of Canada to step in and say, no, you don't have to financially be responsible for what you did. We have to apologize. Why do they need government protection on this? And then, it's funny because I think about, like, we think 20 years sober, like that's a long time. And we talk about Michelle mentioned the younger generations understand this stuff a lot better. Like, they just okay, that's wrong. We should not do that. Like, that's pretty basic. And I think it's interesting because only 8 years before you got sober was the final residential school closure.
Oh, wow. That's true.
Holy shit. So when we talk about Rodney King, that was 5 years before residential schools were closed in Canada officially.
Holy shit, dude.
So
and see, I was down there, so I didn't know the connection there between Rodney King and
and so like Canada itself is really in its infancy of actually going, hey, I don't think we are racist, but there might be a sliver of potential that there could be racism in Canada. And I feel like that's where Canada is. because there's so much opposition to things that if you just sit down and you actually think about it, you'd go, why are you opposed to that? And I think it's just this bred racism. Like Michelle and I grew up with it. You grew up with it. I never stopped hearing how crappy Indigenous people were. There was a lot of Asian hate in my household. Things like that. And so you just like, that's our generation, and we got to unlearn this now. And I think that's the burden that we all face, is unlearning it. Whereas the youth go, yeah, that's just stupid. We should not do that. Yeah. Like they don't need to unlearn because they've learned it already.
Well, and because they weren't taught something that was a lie, right? Yeah. Like right away. They weren't given all youth.
Lie. There are some youth that are still being taught these things for sure. But I think more and more
imagine people are some people's kids.
Right? But we're just so like, we're not even a generation out of residential schools in Canada.
No.
So like, you know, you look at the States and they're still like, what was her name? Ruby Bridges. She's still alive. Like that wasn't that long ago.
Yeah.
Like it's just insane to think like, oh, you know, that was so far in the past, when it's like, this is right now. And this is why I think so many people have a hard time with it, is because they're having to unlearn all of this in a world that's basically turning to shit.
Well, and I do want to bring up something that I think a lot of folks may not understand. Like you and I graduated, you graduated in class in 93. I graduated in class in 94. So if my dad, and
I was 92,
right? If my dad did not have custody of me, I would end up with my mom, and I would have gone through Indian residential school instead of the public school that I met my husband at, and we continued from there. So that proximity to whiteness mattered there so that I would have public education. But that bigger picture too is that, you know, the gravity of what Indian residential school, you know, I should have gone. So when people say it's far in the past, like it is absolutely not far in the past. I should have gone. And I
it's
think
a yesterday.
Exactly. And instead, Darcy and I went to the same school as Dina Henshaw. But here's an example of, you know, privilege that goes through that stolen land, settler colonial, inherited wealth compared to a status native, right? And I had to do night schools while both Darcy and I worked full time in order to start drafting, right? Like the choices that I had in front of me were absolutely not the same, solely based off of socioeconomic status, as opposed to, you know, the lie that Darcy and I were raised to believe that one, there's a middle class, and two, that if you work hard enough, you'll be okay.
Oh my God, that's the biggest lie of all. That's such a lie. Right? If you just work hard enough, man, you're going to like, you can be Jeff Bezos with just some hard work, right? Like,
but these were the lies we were all taught, though, right?
100%. But that's the American dream right there. Like, I remember being taught the American dream, right? Is that you can do anything.
Yep.
Like, I just remember teachers saying it, police, whoever.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
Yep.
You're born in America, you could do anything. Fuck you.
Be an astronaut, be all these things. That's right. And then when you get actually into there, they're like, no, you can't do that. Sorry.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting though, because like, I think people, when you say systemic racism, again, I don't think they really understand, because unless you experience it, you don't really get it.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest, I haven't experienced a lot of racism in my life personally. I've only done it through peripheral. For an example, I think I've even, you know, I don't know if I mentioned it on Lyre, but we went to a hotel in Red Deer and were turned away because Michelle was clearly wearing too much Indigenous stuff, like earrings.
What was the name of the hotel? Are you willing to say it?
It was I think it was the Radisson, wasn't it? Yeah. Okay. So
I just read another story about a hotel in Sylvan Lake that was just shitty. I don't think it was the same one.
Well, let's be clear. Central Alberta is like the racist heartbeat of Alberta.
Yeah. If you don't see the RCMP on the highways, it's because they're at a Klan rally in Alberta.
or they're hurting somebody. Yeah, that's how it goes.
Yeah, or they're beating somebody up.
But you know, it's funny because like we are just going through this right now where everybody thinks these great benefits that come with the Indigenous card and stuff, but the systemic racism, like, to get that frigging card for our daughter.
Yeah.
So when you're born, immediately, like within a 2-week time frame, you have your social insurance card in the mail. Like when you're born, you're signing paper for that social insurance number. It's done.
Yeah.
But it doesn't work that way for Indigenous. Why, you might ask?
Yeah.
Because it's Indigenous. And so this is like, we have worked on this for 3 years. Well, I say we more, so mostly Michelle. It's been like 3 years, 2 applications. Now we have to do another step because she went from 15 when we applied to over 16 now. So she's considered an adult. It's a different application, blah, blah, blah.
Jesus.
Plus, you have to have a long form birth certificate, which I don't think a province in Canada issues. So you got to pay for that. You got to have all this other paperwork. You got to have guarantors. You got to, like, it's harder to get this than it is to get your passport. And like, you want to talk systemic racism. There's reasons why these roadblocks are there. And it's because they want to force those who can't buy all the shit from registries you got to do, can't do all the paperwork, and can't spend 3 goddamn years of their life working on this shit to just go away. It's just easier to just not.
And to be really clear, it actually took other lawsuits done by people before me in order for my child to qualify for status today.
You know, even for Michelle to have it took a lot.
Yeah.
A Supreme Court decision.
Yeah. Well, and that's very telling, right? Is that there had to be a Supreme Court decision to make it okay for Indigenous people to be Indigenous. And like the whole idea, if folks just don't see that the federal government having control of that is wrong, right? Like that is just wrong. If we're really treaty partners, right? Like that's not how we should be treating our partners.
Yeah.
Like,
and one of the policies I haven't spoke about is the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And that was a group of Indigenous peoples from all around the world working really hard in Geneva to create these documents. And of course, Canada, the US, Australia were some of the last ones to adopt it because they are settler colonial states that are still oppressing Indigenous peoples. So they were the last ones to agree to these. And we've had people locally, we had people across Canada, we had people internationally that were all a part of creating that document, which actually both the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report as well as the National Inquiry report, they're both founded with that document as well, because it needed to be acknowledged as a document we should all be following. And now it is so-called implemented, but as you still see, you know, the wetsuit to win can still be beaten and taken away at gunpoint in any moment. And that's still, it's unacceptable. Fisher is out on both coasts struggling with overreach of the law on their treaty rights. You know, these are still issues that are present in 2024. So despite all of these laws and such that are supposed to be in our favor.
Yeah, well, and despite that, and what folks might not know is that the RCMP in Canada, whoever it is in the States, they have all kinds of federal police and other police down there, state police, and whoever else does their assaults on Indigenous populations. We have the RCMP, which is our big one. We don't realize that most citizens who like don't consider themselves bootlickers like someone who just loves the cops no matter what, because I don't know, lots of reasons why. But if you're a bootlicker and you think the RCMP are just doing what the law says they should do, well, that's the systemic racism we're talking about. Because if there's a law that protects them while they attack Indigenous populations on their own sovereign land, this is the problem. There's your systemic racism. It's built right into their procedures, much like CPS's is built into their procedures. Like, and they don't even know it. Some don't even know it, right? Because they'll die on that hill of, no, we're not racist. Like a hill that lots of white folks will die on, I'm sure, is that, no, I've never been racist. I'm not racist. And what I'm going to do at this point, I'm just going to suggest a couple books to some white folks out there. If you're interested, check out Let This Radicalize You. I don't have the author's name on hand. I just read it. And also Nice Racism. I encourage white folks like myself to read these books. Read them on your own. You don't have to read them in a book club, but if you get into a book club that is reading them, awesome, because then you'll be able to discuss some of the subjects. And what it's taught me is so many things, but one of them is that, yeah, indeed, I have been racist. And not only have I been racist, but I've been biased. The only thing I can do now is try not to be those things today, right, in my decisions, and try to be aware that these biases and these ideas that I have come from privilege. They come from being privileged my whole life. And that's what allows me to keep perpetuating it. And I don't know what it's like for other people. I'm just throwing these books out there because there is another way to look at things. There is another way. And that way might be hard at first. Like if I suggest if I'm consulting with a group and they ask like, well, what are some recommendations? And I say, well, first is anti-racism now, and understanding anti-Blackness biases, anti-Indigenous biases, and any anti-immigration or anti-people of color biases, like all of these biases. And Michelle, you mentioned it, like anti-Blackness is insidious in our cultures, in North American cultures. And I will suggest it's probably similar across the planet, unless you're in a country that is predominantly filled with Black people, right? Because and even then, there's probably still systemic racism that tries to keep those folks from ever standing up, right? Because we know that colonial powers have extorted and exploited African countries since time immemorial, since colonialism began. And so that's still happening. And I know people don't want to talk about it because they might not get the new iPhone if we stop doing that stuff. But that is all tied together, right? And so another couple books to read, The 100-Year War on Palestine, and then another book is on Palestine. Of course, this is in connection to reading the 97, right? 97 calls to action?
94.
94 calls to action and the 297 calls of justice, right?
231.
31. Okay, so my brain, that's how my non-linear brain put it together. So thank you, Michelle.
Yeah,
but they're essential for us to, in my mind, those are just beginnings, right? Because once we get to beginning the foundation of some of this information, like for example, and some folks would never know this, never read the book. I never would have known it if I didn't read it. But a part of Let's Let This Radicalize You, part of the book talked about stuff down in the States during the pandemic that I never would have learned without reading it. Yeah. That some cities withheld vaccinations from poor areas. And who do you think lives in the poor areas down in the States? Who do you think is ghettoized down there? Like, I don't even have to say it, right? And so learning that, just that one little thing, a tiny little thing that a municipal government would actually hold back vaccination from certain areas because they didn't have enough, quote unquote, that is racism. Like that's systemic racism. And I know there's going to be like moderate whites right now saying that's poverty issue. I know it is. It's also racism because in the States, in Canada, poverty is very much connected to racism. Right.
Yeah, actually, for folks who don't know, I did run for municipal politics and I learned a lot about, urban development based off of what they call redlining, where they purposely put people of color, where they purposely put, new folks and keep them away from the white established communities. And I'll also say, obviously, the reservations system is redlining. So I think it's really important that people understand the gravity of that as well. So for folks who may not understand it, then that just shows it's one thing to say poverty. It's another to understand what systemic poverty is. And you can't help but see how systemic poverty and systemic racism are married to create this world. So, and kind of back to some book recommendations, like that one, Nice Racism by Robin DiAngelo. She is a white woman, so you're not hearing it from a Black person. And she has another one about white privilege before that as well. And here in Calgary, we have the Settlers Book Club. If you're not from Calgary and you're not, it's just a Zoom link. So you can be a part of that particular book club. And then I have my Indigenous focused one as well. So, there's so many podcasts out there. Like right now I've been re-listening to Connie Walker's CBC special on St. Michael's.
Mm-hmm.
And it's horrific, obviously, but it's about her personal family journey of
Mm-hmm.
trying to name the priests that abused her family, her uncles, her dad. And it was shocking for me to learn the first time I listened to it, that in Ottawa today, on the beautiful Riverway, are like buildings that are for basically these pedophile priests to retire and die in,
Mm-hmm.
and nuns as well. And I just found that so horrific, that my
Mm-hmm.
people are dying on the streets because of the colonial trauma that they've endured, and the very predators that should have been charged not only will never be charged, but they will live a nice little life in a comfortable setting, as opposed to all of the Indian residential school survivors. And so it is very upsetting to me that most Canadians are completely unaware of all of this.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not the way it should be.
Yeah. And I'm gonna like, I just know I think about this all the time when it comes to like faith, right? And people who continue to support some of these structures that have done some of these harms and that continue to perpetuate the harm, right? Because now, you and I we've known each other since this whole like the 2019 call where churches decided, oh, we believe now, we want to help now, we want to be all these things now, because we realize if we're not, we're going to run out of money and we're going to die. And nobody wants the churches to die, apparently, except for some of us. We're like, fine. But the idea that, you know, this to me is how much power they have, is because all they have to do is say, oh, well, now we realize where our theology was wrong and we really want to change it because we believe that all queer people do believe, can be loved by God. And it's like, fuck you for thinking we're afterthought, first of all. And fuck you for thinking that we're going to come. And don't get me wrong, I know that within my community of queer people, there's lots of people with faith. And I'm not shitting on that because I understand like faith is important for lots of people. However, I am going to say, as a queer person, shame. I have a real hard time with that. And it's like, oh, yeah, but this theology is okay. So, what people have done is they've just changed the language of what they teach in order to get more people in their seats. And don't get me wrong, I understand there's probably been like, since the beginning of time, there's probably lots of queer folks who are just waiting for churches to invite them in. And I think that's probably powerful for some folks because they were never invited in before, right? The way I look at it is like, well, you're going to invite me in now. It's a little too fucking late. That's my opinion, right? Like my opinion is you've done your damage and you can reap what you sow now. Yeah. Since the church is so fond of saying that, you can reap what you sow. That's right. My idea of it, is that you can now reap what you sow, because most of it's performative. Michelle and Darcy, we've talked about this, like within the church, within law enforcement, it's all performative shit, right? Yeah. Now, that doesn't mean it shouldn't happen. I'm not saying that. Like, so when I say it's performative, it doesn't mean it doesn't have any value. It just means that it's not the kind of value that, say, you and I are looking for, Michelle or Darcy, right? Like, we're looking for stuff that has substance, that is sustainable, that will actually lead to real change, right? And that was another thing I wanted to talk about, because for 20 years of sobriety, and I was also working with the cops, and I was part of that fucking system, like more for longer than I wish I was now, especially now that I'm trying to untangle some of the entanglements that working in those fields leaves you with, right? Like, first of all, with the idea that, well, not all cops are bad kind of thing. Like that was me. Like I have no problem admitting it. I wish I didn't have to admit that, but I was, because at one point I was a cop. I was a transit cop, and I was like, and in my mind, if everyone was bad, that included me, right? And so, and that's like the ego saying, no, it can't be you. You can't be bad. And the truth is, I have lots of bad tendencies. Like I have all kinds of like unhealthy tendencies. And when I was working law enforcement, some of them came out every day, right? Mm-hmm. Some of those things would come out every day. And just doing your job. Like once once things opened up, I guess the last couple years here really helped me see where, even though I was just doing my job, and I use quotation marks, I was just doing my job, because you and I both know that's what the cops say before they hit you with a baton. I'm just doing my job. You shouldn't be here. If you weren't here, I wouldn't hit you.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. But like the idea that when you're in the culture, it's almost impossible to see it because it includes you, right? And so once I was free of the culture, I could see it even though it included me, but I could see it a little more clearly. And like, trust me, I think I've talked to Darcy about this many times through the last couple of years, where it's just really hard adjusting to this, like, and not hard because it's wrong, hard to adjust because it's so contrary to what I was told, you know? That law enforcement, it's up to you. And again, that goes back to this individualism that I was raised in, where it's up to you. Like, it's don't have a community. Like, don't trust other people. It's up to you. And as long as you're good and you work hard, good things will happen.
Yeah. It's a good promise.
Right?
Yeah, just play along and everything will be fine.
Yeah. Yeah, and so here we are 20 years later, right? When I sobered up, I was a mess, totally. But at the same time that I was a mess because of the booze, I realized looking back that my whole life wasn't a mess at the time. There was parts of my life that were going really well. Like I was working. I mean, but there's something to I don't know. Michelle, you mentioned sobriety and like the 12 steps of sobriety, that and how they connected to the 12-step fellowships in general, right? And I think I understand why Don Coyas created that program, was because it's so almost in line. It's almost learnable for other folks, not just Indigenous folks, right? So that it can be utilized by so many more folks, and so many more folks could be brought in to understand Indigenous ways of living. And in my mind, that was like a nice evolution of the 12 steps. I think they still need to continually evolve. But I think without listening to Indigenous peoples, we are missing out on that next stage of evolution, right? Like, and by ignoring Black voices, by criminalizing Black voices like Taylor's, we are missing out not only on obviously a wealth of information about how our society really is running, for people who don't necessarily get on the camera and answer the media, right? For folks who the media might not even like ask because maybe they're just too angry. And anyway, so I'm babbling. I'm just like thinking about all these things out loud. And I was thinking about this podcast for a couple of weeks because I was like, well, 20 years, what are you going to talk about? Like, it's a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Right. And it's a lot of stuff and not all good. You know, like this will be the first year I'm not taking a cake somewhere at a room, right? And the first year that I'm not like taking a medallion. And it's my 20-year mark, and that probably seems crazy to people out there. Why wouldn't I? But the truth is, Michelle mentioned it earlier in the podcast. It's about like they're being sober. Yeah, it's hard. It was hard to get sober, and sometimes it's hard to stay sober and stay like sober-minded, right? But the reality is, being sober is not harder than being unhoused. Being sober is not harder than being racialized. Being sober is not harder than having hate perpetrated against you, whether you're queer, trans, two-spirit, whatever the case may be. Like, being sober is not harder than that. Like, it's not harder than going through that. And so what we've done though is we've taken sobriety and elevated it up to a place where if you're sober, you must be doing well. Right?
Yeah.
And we've talked at length, Darcy, like we know that just because we're sober, it doesn't mean we're doing well. And there's a whole lot that goes into being well, quote unquote well. Whereas that 12-step industry it's all focused on not picking up, right? And there's the lie that's perpetrated that if you don't pick up, and you follow our way of living, life will be easier for you, right? Where does
Yeah.
that sound like? Doesn't that sound familiar? Like if you just give your life to Christ, everything's going
Yeah.
to be okay, right? Um, Not knowing that there's a lot of nuance to that shit. Like you can sober up and then like life happens, and there's all kinds of shit you have to deal with. So like, and that's not the hardest part for me anymore, staying sober. The hardest part for me is being honest with myself, right? And saying, holy fuck, like, yeah, I have been racist. I have been that book, Nice Racism. I mean, I got to go back and read the one that she wrote first, but that book just like opened my eyes to the things that I have done in my life, which have been very much based on like anti-black bias, anti-indigenous bias. You know what I mean? Anti-people of color bias, anti-immigration biases. Like all of those things have perpetrated themselves in my life at one time or another, right? Have been
Yeah.
in part of my living for at least for a short time, or at different periods. Hey, Floyd. Floyd's staring at me like,
Kind of
what are
the
you
same
doing?
conversation about activism though,
Mm,
and sobriety journeys. And you
hmm
okay, so the part where you're not sober, but then the part where you are sober, and it's a journey of unpacking the trauma and healing. Well,
hmm
I see that in the activist community. And I should also bring up too, as many as there are Indigenous people who are houseless because of imposed trauma, imposed poverty, um, land theft, et cetera. Many of the queer community have been kicked out and marginalized because of their queer status, whether their sexual orientation or their sexual gender diversity. The very settler families kick them out on the streets. So many of our unhoused population are also folks who are part of the queer community, right? So I think it's important to talk about this. So,
hmm
we're talking about sobriety, we're talking about healing, we're talking about the trauma and unpacking trauma and going through the motions of the 12-step program, but also bigger picture of understanding colonial trauma, understanding
hmm
racism, understanding all of these things. Like it's a lot of work. And you can see in the activist community, folks who come in with that good energy of maybe
hmm
not all cops are bad and maybe we can help our community, to like now you see people who are supposed to be well-respected activists who
hmm
still have anti-indigenous bias, who still have
Anti-black bias.
anti-queerness, yeah,
Yep.
anti-black. So you
Yep.
see where they are on their healing journey as well, and where they are on their unpacking oppression dynamics. And that's ultimately what we're talking about, is those oppression dynamics.
hmm
And that systemic racism also takes many forms of gendered
Yeah.
violence. So that just becomes an oppression dynamic issue. And then because we're also talking about sobriety and mental wellness,
hmm
we need to start taking things further and talking about, the ableism in
Yeah.
all of the work that we do,
Oh,
and how we're not really addressing, underlying health issues, underlining
yeah.
mental health issues, and how even the sobriety movement can hinder people by being like, well, cannabis is bad, or
hmm
ADHD meds are bad, or schizophrenic meds are bad. And it's like, ugh. So now we're being ableist
Yeah.
in helping people in their healing journey. So
Yes.
we have to be careful about, understanding all these intersectionalities, and understanding
Mhm.
everybody's journey looks a little different. And even for me, trying not to judge people when they showcase their anti-blackness or
Yeah.
anti-indigenous bias or anti-queer, and trying to work
hmm
with them while trying to also lead the horse to the water, in hopes that
hmm
one day they will drink the water.
Yeah. Hoping,
Yeah.
hoping.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned the ableism and all kinds of things that are part of the recovery community, right? But that the recovery community doesn't seem to acknowledge in a wholesale kind of way, which is the 12-step fellowships. The whole foundation of those programs was designed for people like me, just so everybody knows. It was designed for middle class white people. Like, and so if you are a racialized human and you go to those programs and you find difficulty with it, there's a reason why. It's you're not going crazy. Like it's not, and it's not because the people in the room are right when they say, well, you just can't do it our way. You're not going to be able to do it. Yeah, because some of us can't, right? Like, and some of us shouldn't even try. That's my opinion. because I've seen people try, and then die, like, because they're not given another opportunity or another option. And I can assure you, I've been around that program for almost 20 years, this last year aside, because I spent lots of time away from it, trying to unpack some of my own anger and my own stuff, which is mine. However, there are some things about those programs that have nothing to do with me. The fact that they were written for me, the fact that they try so hard to convince you that they weren't written for me should tell you that they were written for me. Right? Because there's parts of the book, and I say for me, and I just mean white people, okay? It was definitely written by white people, and they were both cis males, and they were both wealthy, or at one point were wealthy. So we have to think about that. Think about where that comes from. And don't get me wrong, there's parts in the book, in the big book, that talk about how other things that are outside of their purview, but they don't go into detail because it's not in their purview. So they keep talking about Christianity, right? The idea of God. So if you go into these rooms and you have a real problem with God, you'll be ostracized, most likely, especially if you're verbal about it. Now, there's been people who I've seen come in who are not verbal about it because they know what'll happen. And so they come in and they can't be themselves. So inevitably, they'll find somewhere else to go where they can be themselves, right? And don't get me wrong, I know the 12 steps have a huge grasp, especially in Alberta. What do they call it? Rocky Mountain Recovery. The conglomerate of all these rich organizations getting together and telling people what recovery is all about. And have you seen the minister of our province who does that? Yeah, quite strange, man. We have a quite strange province for that. But it's overall, right? It's overall the effect that those rooms have on people. I believe I've been in those rooms and I've seen like active open racism, right? Like openly racism. I mean, I don't participate in it, but of course, eventually I can't be around it because you can't stop it. Like, I would always say something. I've said many things in those meetings to old timers or newcomers who were bigoted. But at the same time, eventually that gets fucking old, and you're not changing anybody's mind, right? Like, it's this program, and if you have people in who are looked at with high esteem, those people almost have carte blanche to say whatever they want in those rooms. Which is, to me, is crazy. And obviously it shows that the system is pretty like flawed, right?
Well, and I think it shows how linear our thinking is in everything. So for a lot of people, that's the only way to get sober. And if you do it any other way, you're just doing it wrong. I've experienced that in scuba diving, of all goddamn things. Like, there's a right way and a wrong way. And it's like, come on. If you're breathing underwater, I think you're doing okay.
If you're alive, you're still fine.
But I feel like, and I don't mean to dog on churches, but I do feel like this linear thinking of black and white, you're either on board or you're against us attitude. It comes out like that in these things. And I think it's interesting because I think for you, it helped you get into sobriety. It helped 100%. You continue that path. But I think
it's right where I needed to be at that time.
And I think it's kind of like, the doctor who fixed did as much as they did to fix your back. Like, they did that, and it kind of, you had to go through the pain, but now you're able to walk around and move around again. Not necessarily without pain, but that's how I see those organizations, is like, they're like the cast. They're going to deal with the break. So you've broke with you're like, I don't want to do this shit anymore. Okay, I'm here they can kind of get you through that. But at the same time, if you're a person that's not going to work for, and you walk in those rooms, they can be just as detrimental as helpful, because they can walk into a room and go, well, if I don't even fit in with this crowd, well, I must be a loser, and I might as well just go back out and die. Right? Like, I can see that being somebody's mentality when there's other options. We've built a society claiming to be multicultural, and I use air quotes, but nobody can see it. But we've only built systems for one group of people. And if you don't if you don't follow that group, you don't fit in. And it's just not, and that's just not the case. And I think people more and more, and I think especially over the last 20 years of your sobriety, you've seen more and more alternatives come into play.
Oh yeah.
But a lot of people are still on that one track mind. And I think once you get beyond that, like even for yourself, you're not going to the rooms anymore. And I think it's just a natural, like you've gone beyond that need, and you're on to what is fulfilling you now to help keep you sober, right?
Yeah,
and I just
totally.
I think those rooms can be scary but good, but at the same time, it's that linear thinking that it's just this way, this is the only way. And it's the same as when you look at racism and things like that. Like it's like, well, we don't want to upset what's good for us, so it can only work this way.
Yeah.
But capitalism can work other ways, and this can work other ways. And I think it's really interesting to, if you go back and look just at your own evolution over the 20 years, how important things were for you at certain times, but how maybe irrelevant they are now.
Oh my dude, seriously, most of it.
Yeah, and it could be not just AA rooms or peer support, but it could be anything, right?
Yeah. And it's true. I think like Michelle mentioned and you mentioned, man, like the idea that the idea that we could look at sobriety without taking into account racism, without taking into account poverty, without taking into account accessibility, like all these different things that matter to people. But we haven't given them any consideration. And you can see it in the rooms because there's still old people in those rooms that will tear down rainbow flags. So if you're a ally of ours, of the queer community in any way, like recognize how hurtful that is for us. And we may not even say anything because you might be a newcomer in a room and you see this old timer tear the rainbow flag down. What you're seeing and what's happening is the perpetuated bigotry of the Christian church. Like do you think the guy who's taken the rainbow flag down doesn't have an idea about God and the Christianity? You should ask them.
Yeah, I will say gendered violence is a big part of these AA rooms. For women, we've had to educate ourselves and likely the queer community. There's something called a 13 stepper. And a 13 stepper is one of those guys who basically is a predator and capitalize off of the newcomers, and usually is in a gendered violent way, in the sense that they're there to pick up a girl or maybe a young gay man. And then that's it. It's, you're taking a vulnerable person with somebody with, predatory intentions. And this is a mix for some horrible abuse. And so I've met many women who try to, AAA room just to go get another crappy predator, them blaming themselves like this is somehow their fault, not the patriarchy. And and then not,
that's a good point.
Working on moving forward with these organizations. And frankly, I don't want to go to a church. And
yeah, me neither.
I've said that a million times to people. Like if your community event or anything is affiliated with a church, like I can't be a part of that. And it's funny, we've been and I get really upset when people from churches come to my door to solicitate, because I'll say, I'm sorry, I'm Indigenous, and I actually see what you're doing is incredibly harmful, like violent, what you're doing, coming to my door and going to the door of other Indigenous people in a time of reconciliation where you're voting for some of the most bigoted, sexist, homophobic, transphobic people, and you vote these people in on purpose and then attack our communities. You just coming to my door is offensive to me. But there's no trespassing sign or no solicitation sign that kind of encapsulates that enough for me. So I don't have that sign on my door. But God, I just get so offended by the amount of folks from churches who think it's acceptable to come to my door, or politicians for that matter. I'm done trying to educate so-called professionals and so-called politicians on these issues. Like, it is willful ignorance.
It's willful. And when they come to your door, Michelle, they're not there for a discussion, right? Like they're just there to tell you what they want to tell you and get you to conform, and you mentioned it. This is important. And I was gradually getting there, because not only are the rooms like racist and bigoted, but they're also like intensely misogynistic, like intensely, to the point where, like you mentioned, there are many predators. Unfortunately, there are even female predators, so even female step 13 people, right? Like the idea within there that you have power and someone else doesn't, right? And like, to be honest, one of my sponsors, that's how they met their old, like their girlfriend was it was her first day at a meeting and he picked her up. This was a long time ago, an old sponsor. Obviously don't work with that person anymore for lots of reasons, but like learning that that's how a person who is also instructing other people, that's how they live. They live like that was okay. You know what I mean? Um, and they don't even talk about it, of course, because it's not their reality. That's only for the women to worry about, right? It's only for the women that they used to worry about, not for them. Um, and I wish I could say that I was always like perfect through the years in AA. I'm sure I went out on a date or two with women that were new. Um, and but I would meet women and men too, like people who you connect with, and things happen. We're adults, right? The intention was not to pick them up or do anything like that, but shit happens. And the one of the troubles with being in there is that for some people, it's not just shit happening. It's like a regular occurrence that they do. And what surprises me about that, honestly, is that sometimes the men that do this to women become very popular, very popular. And part of their popularity is based around their whole mechanism of drawing the women in, right? And I'm using men as an example because I'm a man and I have way more examples of men being predatory than women. So that's just the truth. I've been there for 20 years and I've seen way more men be predatory than women. So that we're just going to throw it out there because it's a
Statistically,
misogynistic.
that checks.
Yeah, and it's a misogynistic program, right? Like it was developed by men who believed their women should be subservient. It was written by those men. Like, so there's all kinds of misogyny interwoven into it, just like there's racism and bigotry interwoven into it. I think the idea is that hopefully over time, as a man myself, you learn that that's just not good. You learn that, first of all, um, not that it's not good to be with someone who doesn't have any time. Like that happens all the time. They're adults. Like we're adults in these programs. The trouble is, what we're talking about here with predators is we're talking about those specific people who absolutely do things on purpose to get together with someone who's new, just because they have more time, therefore more power, right? Which in my mind is another problem with the rooms, is that if you have time, you have power, right? And that you are okay. And let me tell you, 20 years later, I was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. I was diagnosed with other things in my brain. And the truth is, I'm probably in some ways sicker than I was when I came in. Like, in terms of actually understanding my mental health, I feel sicker, right? But that's only because I've been able to gradually, with the help of professionals, not the rooms. Let me reiterate that. The rooms at no time have been helpful in terms of my mental illness. Not once. Not once have I gone to a 12-step room where somebody talks respectfully about mental illness and about needing medicine. I've never seen it. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm just saying I've never heard it in 20 years. All I've heard is the other side of things in 20
That is
years.
so sad.
Right? It's tragic. And if I was one of those people who listened to everybody in the rooms and just said, "Oh, I better not go to the doctor," I'd be dead right now. And I want people to really understand that, because, like, just because I was educated enough to know that what people are saying in the rooms is wrong, that's just flat out wrong, right? That you're not morally sick if you have a mental illness. You're not morally sick if you're an alcoholic. Like, you're just sick. The fact that we start adding these adjectives to the sickness is our own judgment, right? It's like when people who don't understand that mental illness is a real thing because you can't see it, right? Or they say, "No, you don't have ADHD. You don't have anything. You're fine. What you really need is some prayer." right?
Or to pick
Like
up you pick up your bootstraps or
yeah. But in those rooms, it's prayer. You
yeah.
just need to do the program better. You wouldn't be so sick if you were doing the program well, right? Like you wouldn't feel so shitty. And I hear this all the time because now that I've been separated from those rooms, um, I'm working with lots of people who go to the rooms and they're trying to make sense of some of these things. And what I tell them is you just can't. It's the way it is. Now, I've seen lots of people stick around and try to change the rooms, and then they end up going back out out of frustration, or they just go somewhere else out of frustration. Um, and so there's so much nuance to it. This is why when someone says, well, Dave, like, do you hate the rooms? No, I don't hate really anything. I have a pretty big hate for the Catholic Church and the church in general. I'm going to go ahead and allow that to be true. Because there is, I don't know if it's hate, but it's anger for sure. I have a lot of anger over it. I'm still not certain I hate anyone, but I do have some anger over those institutions, that's for sure, and the perpetuation of them through some of these smaller, what I call like Christianity light. That's what AA is. AA is Christianity light. It's Christianity for the guys who can't say God. It's or the guys who won't say Jesus. We're just going to give them something else. And now after 20 years of study in that program, that's what I see. I see Christianity light, right? It's we're not going to massacre you unless you make us by not answering your door.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I think it's an incredible journey. I mean, so much in the world has changed in the last 20 years. I think your world has changed so much in the last 20 years. And honestly, the people around you, I mean, it was only 7 years ago or so that, we met. And like, it's just interesting how much, even in the time I've known you, how much you've changed and how much through all the things that you're doing to make yourself a healthier human. I think it's an incredible amount of change, even in the time that I've seen you. And that's not even half the time that you've been sober. So I got to say, it's kind of impressive, man, to be honest.
Well, I appreciate that. And I do, I have to say that I'm not alone doing it, right? Like there's been incredible catalyst humans, like just humans, not something dramatic happened to me necessarily, but just the humans that are around me, and even some that aren't around me now, they have just been the catalysts I need to keep going, right? Like to keep trying to figure out what is it that makes Dave tick. And 20 years in, I'm just starting to figure some of the stuff out, right? Like, and I know there's folks that are newly sober or thinking about getting sober, and you think, well, I'll just get sober and everything will be good. It could be better, you know what I mean? Like you might get sober and your life just gets a little bit easier because you're not hungover, you're not drunk, you're not high all the time. That kind of stuff absolutely plays a huge role in the beginning to like sticking around. However, you might find that you sober up and your life is shitty right away. And what that's telling you is it's not necessarily saying don't be sober. What it's saying is, holy shit, life has been hard for a long time. And now that I'm sober, I'm able to see how fucking hard it's been, right? Yeah. Like, because most of us, when we're using or drinking, we're coping. It's not about like being bad people. It's about, or making choices that are just, you had good choices and you made bad ones. Like, that's what you did. And I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that at all. Most of us, before we came into some program, we're just floating around. We were just trying to survive. And very few of us were all bad. You know what I mean? I don't even know what that would look like, because humans have nuance. So it's kind of like I've learned lots, but then I don't know anything. Like I feel like I've learned a bit, but I don't feel like I know anything. I feel like, like I've had some difficulty, letting go of stuff and things associated with the policing for that, for an example. But there's something about it that I won't do. And I noticed this a couple of weeks ago. I won't just I can't be like other people. And I'm not saying everybody's like this, not at all. But I can't just write people off, unless they're absolutely unwilling to engage in like some sort of productive stuff, I can't just write them off. Like it doesn't make any sense, because then we'll just be writing everybody off, and everybody will just hate us for writing them off, when what we really want is for people to work together, right?
Yeah.
Now that doesn't mean that I'm going to go back and work with the police. I'll never work with the police again. I won't even fucking talk to them, right? But it does mean that I'm not going to necessarily unfriend people who I love.
Yeah.
Right? Like I'm not built that way. I am built the way that I'll never do anything in quote unquote performative for them ever again. Right? That I can control. But I honestly have come to this place where I have genuine people that I love that happen to do a job that is shitty, right? But their job isn't actually shitty, because they're doing part of the good work that, you know, convinces us that not all cops are bad. Like, but I have to like qualify that and say, this person's my friend long before they were a policeman. And I can't get my head around that, man. I can't do it. I think it would be easier to just be like, oh, fuck it.
Yeah.
You know, like to just be like, no, fuck them all. Like, but it might be easier, but I don't know if that's right, you know? And it doesn't feel right to me. So what other people do is great, and I support it. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to necessarily do it. Like it's
Yeah.
like we all have to come to terms with this in our own way. And as much as I've said, you know, being sober isn't as tough as being racialized or being attacked for your queerness or any of those things, like it's not harder than that, because like getting sober is probably, on the scale of difficult things to experience, it's probably difficult, but I don't think it even qualifies in terms of some of the other difficulties humans have to overcome, right? But I think what we've done is we've put it in the hands of us, those who have stopped drinking, and they're looking to us to make the rules about it. And it's like, well, in my mind, there are no rules to it. I don't know what sober means to you. I don't need to. You don't know what sober means to me, and you don't need to.
Yeah.
That doesn't have any bearing on it. We don't get to decide when someone else is sober any more than I get to decide when someone else is a drug. However, we have a province that is trying to convince us that we do.
Yeah.
That we do have a right to say you shouldn't have your freedom anymore because you use substances. Can you imagine?
Yeah, it's almost like as if they took another group at some point in time in history and said, "You don't deserve to have that, and we're going to take that away from you." I mean, I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but I feel like that happened in Canada before, where they just said, "Hey," or even in Alberta. Gosh, I just feel like it wasn't that long ago that we were sterilizing people for their own benefit.
It wasn't that long ago, right? Yeah.
But gosh, I feel like that was an abuse system too, and I can't imagine how this is going to go with the forced recovery. Like
Darcy,
it doesn't seem like it's going to be abusive at all to people.
No, don't you remember how lovely forced sterilization was for humans?
Well, and if we've learned anything from history, it's that one size fits all. One thing fits everything. I mean, that's the theme of this whole conversation is there's one way to get sober, there's one way to live life, and there's one religion, right? Like again, it's that stupid linear thinking. It's so ridiculous.
It's narrow-minded, right? It's narrow-minded for us to think. First of all, it's narrow-minded for anyone to think that their experience is the only experience humans have ever had. Yeah. And I think, you know what I mean? Like to say, oh, well, I have this one friend who said this thing. And so I've learned that too, like, is just white folks trying to defend themselves and pit a person of color against another person of color, right? Where it's like, oh, well, my friend who's also Black doesn't feel that way, so I'm not going to feel that way.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But we don't know if our other friend, who is also a Black person, right? We don't know how hard it is for them to be racialized, and maybe they just want to be close to somebody white.
Yeah.
Right. And why wouldn't you? If that's what is, if white supremacy, and we all know that, the three of us know that is at work every day, that I think, Michelle, you might have mentioned it, that proximity to whiteness, that proximity to power, can make some racialized humans act like white people, right? Because it's that proximity. And then of course, yeah, survival of the ones just like me, all those years hiding my queerness. It was survival, right? I had proximity to power and I liked it, right? And I want to say there was some deep meaning to it, but I have a feeling it was just proximity to power and I liked it. I have a feeling that's what it was, that I just enjoyed the privilege. And so I lived off of it. And in so doing, I, I harmed, continuously harmed folks, even in my own community, the queer community, right? By pretending that I was somehow special or different. And that individualist attitude that comes from the American dream, right? Like you can do whatever you want. You just have to work hard.
Yeah.
And that's
and fall in line and follow orders and
that's
do
right.
what we tell you and don't obey the police and all these things. It's just you're brainwashed and you're trained to be a good little worker citizen. And that's just not how everybody fits into not everybody fits into that little box. So
yeah, and how could everyone fit into that little box? I mean, the whole idea of making it a little box is so that not everybody can fit and so that there can be enemies, right? Like
absolutely.
Nothing has been so evident over the last few years as like how Western culture chooses their enemies, right? Like we support Ukraine, we support Israel, but we will not under any circumstances support like brown people. And to me, it's not shocking anymore. It was shocking at first, I think, when I first heard a speech by someone a few years ago who really put, it was Cornel West, who's running for president down in the States. He really put it in perspective, right? Like just talked about how our babies are important as long as they're like our babies and they look like us, right? But that, our governments are more than willing to murder brown babies, no matter where they are, right? Like whether it's here at home with our apartheid system, whether it's the child welfare system taking babies from the nations and trying to assimilate them into settler colonial culture. I appreciate that terminology too, Michelle. Thank you for that, because I just continuously call it white people. And it's more specific and probably more honest, more true.
Well, and the truth is, like, a lot of the most racist people towards me have actually been BIPOC because, anti-Indigenous bias is a different form of racism. So it is important for a lot of people to understand that, like, we can hold that just as I held anti-Black, sentiment. And honestly, I think until people understand, like, we all hold oppression dynamics within us, and we have to learn to be accepting of everyone. And so I get a lot of new Canadians who cannot wrap their heads around the actual history of this land, and that they're treaty partners, and that they are told to be rude to me by their own organizations. So and it should be said that our organizations are Catholic, and they bring in a minimum 50% Christian people, whether we're talking a refugee, whether we're talking immigration, so that we maintain a Christian state. Just that is the truth.
I believe it. And I mean, you see it in our policies, right? You see it in our immigration and refugee policies and it's just come out in so many different ways over the last few years, right? The anti-immigration stuff, and what folks probably may not guess is that anti-immigration is very much white supremacist, right? Like it's very much time to go is what it is. So we are coming to an ending here. And before I get off on another tangent, thank you, Michelle, for sending a little note. I was about to go off. But I know I want to just thank you both for coming on today and talking with me about this. I know lots of it was just me pontificating bullshit. But the reality is I love you both. I'm very grateful for you to come on and that you're my friends. Thank you for sharing in my 20 years of sobriety and for being like incredible humans that as you always are. Thank you.
We're honored to be a part of it, and congratulations on your 20 years. It is worth celebrating always, even if it's not like the cake and the coin. just having friends that are unpacking all of these different traumas and the trauma timeline and understanding, where a lot of this is rooted from, and then dealing with any associated mental health issues that we all have seemed to have accumulated over the course of our lifetime, like us three being really close to 50 in that demographic. So, it's just that this is the reality. And I think it's important. So I'm really proud of you speaking about it so openly, in the hopes that other people will listen and hear that's me. And I didn't see that in these circles.
And it's okay to see it now. It's okay to like make action now, right? Like we don't know what we don't know. And so once we're able to feel some knowledge come in, it's okay if we change our mind. Like it's really okay to change your mind when new information is presented. Like I think, and even I resisted that for a long period of time. I'm not going to pretend like I wasn't there, like where new information would come and I would just reject it because it was contrary to like what was keeping me sober at the time, right? And then gradually though, the truth wore me out. Like the truth from folks who were not even in the program, because it was like being in law enforcement. Being stuck inside law enforcement is just like being inside the rooms. You're in a silo, right? You're in a silo of learning. You're not getting the full picture. And that is really, I guess, the basis of it is I think we're always going to need folks in every community to probably, to some extent, work with the police. I'm not going to shit on those people that do it, but I absolutely won't do it. And that's okay, right? Like I've come to terms with that's not the way I'm going to affect the kind of change that maybe I'm looking for, right?
I've watched enough Indigenous police and Indigenous folks who try to help the police, and I'm one of them. I just know that, it's a healing journey, and a lot of us think we can create the change that we want to see in the world. And it's important that we, are at the table to express those things. And, you get to see who is really open, who really can do the work. And also just takes one chief to not really have buy-in. And I've seen that over the previous one as well. The bigger understanding of what it is that we're trying to achieve here. So, I have a deep respect for that. And I've told Indigenous police and liaisons, you're welcome to heal in my backyard. Because I've been there. I know what it's like. I know how folks will say to your face they want to see change, but then undermine you and bully. And when you're ready to heal from that, my door will be open to you.
And same with mine. With mine. My door is open. If you need someone to talk to, you're part of that process. I won't work with the police, but I absolutely will work with individuals. Like that is 100% what I've always done, what I will continue to do if you need help. Because we talked about lots of stuff that might be wrong out there, and that's great that we did. But we're also talking about stuff that's right. And sometimes that means going through the pain of discovery for yourself, whatever that looks like. And like in my mind, it's just like being queer, right? Like there's no timetable for you to come out or you to embrace it or you to accept it. Even if you choose not to accept your queerness or whatever that case may be, that's okay too, because I understand it's terrifying out here. It's absolutely terrifying at times. And so I get it. And if you're in that category and you need someone to talk to, door is always open, right? Like there's no timeline for it. I don't want to force anyone to move faster than they can, like, but I definitely am here if people need someone to talk to on their walk, right? Like on their journey. Even if you disagree with me, it's okay, right? Like, first of all, you might not even fully disagree with me. You might think you do, but you really might not, because what we're really talking about is being human to one another. Like, is recognizing that there are things in each of our brains and each of our upbringings that makes it hard for us to connect with one another, especially if we look different, right? Like, especially if we look different. It's one of those things. Anyway, you have to take the dog out and I have to let you go. just thank you so much. And yeah, again, like if you're out there in the trenches working on this stuff, Godspeed to you. Whatever that feels like, and that's not a denominational God, trust me. If you don't know me by now, that is not my issue.
Yeah.
Having a denominational God is not my problem. That sounds like a they problem. Right on. And so before we go, like, thank you, Michelle, Darcy,
Thank you.
Darcy as thank you, dude. Like we've been doing this now 7 years, I think.
Yeah, about that.
We're coming up. Yeah, well done, dude. We're starting our 7th season with this episode, I guess. So
yeah,
yeah, thank you to all those who continually support us. I know that Darcy did a great job with the outro, so I'll try not to get into it too much, but I do want to mention a couple things before that outro kicks in. Is check out the Native Calgarian podcast. Michelle Robinson has that. Check out her book club, and check out all the stuff that they have going on and that they share. I know that there's a lot going on there. You just mentioned, Michelle, that your last podcast. I'm going to go back and listen to it right now, because it talks about lots of stuff that we're mentioning. Yeah, so check out that podcast. Check out Stop the Stack YYC. That's to support Taylor McNally. And just to put a happy point on this, how I celebrated 20 years of sobriety was I went to a drag performance called Housing Crisis, put on by the Yulia Borscht and the Danny Phantom.
Nice.
Yeah, and they had a special guest, Ida No, perform as well. That's how I spent my 20 years sober, was enjoying a drag performance with another sober friend and a bunch of people at Congress Coffee. So if you're out there, you're interested in drag performances, and maybe you're not a fan of bars, because I know I have a hard time with bars sometimes. It doesn't, not always, but some nights I just can't go because of the crowd and all the folks drinking and stuff. But the Congress Coffee, really nice spot. Seems to be very queer friendly, and they just mentioned the other night that they're a queer venue. So if you are part of our queer community, maybe check it out. And if you're not a fan of bars, they got good food, good coffee, all that kind of stuff. And then I think that's it. Anything
else?
That's
awesome, Darcy? Man. No, man, just thank you for the show, and yeah, congrats on 20 years, man.
Thanks, man. And congratulations to us on starting our 7th season, dude.
Yeah, man. That's awesome.
Right on. Okay, thank you both. I love you guys. Well, thank you for listening to another episode of Voices in Recovery podcast. We greatly appreciate your support, your listening, your sharing. Also, don't be afraid to check out the Native Calgarian podcast. You will not be disappointed. Michelle Robinson is a wealth of information on so many different subjects. It's hard to narrow it down to one, but I will absolutely say that podcast is about sharing Indigenous people's stories and realities to us. And so I encourage you all to check it out, the Native Calgarian podcast by Michelle Robinson. Also, check out the Walls Down Collective here in Calgary. And if you're able to, just like us, they need donations too. And of course we do. We need support just like everyone else so that we can continue to provide free counseling. What Walls Down Collective, they require for lots of different things. Every Friday they have a pop-up. Yes, I believe it's 3 to 4 nights a week. They have a on-call number you can call if you're in distress. So that's the Walls Down Collective. You can find out the number through them. And Stop the Stack YYC, if you are able to, you can support Stop the Stack YYC through their website, through their Instagram page. They have an Instagram, Facebook, and I believe Stop the Stack has a TikTok. And Walls Down may or may not have a TikTok, but they have Facebook and they have Instagram. The Native Calgarian podcast, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, I believe, just about anywhere. And of course, you can find her podcast on Patreon. There's also one last one that I want to mention is Black Pride YYC. We work with them regularly, find it incredible what those folks are doing. And of course, they have invited everyone that listens to our podcast to come out at any time to their events. So don't be afraid. If it's a Black Pride YYC event, don't be afraid. They're inclusive of everyone. Stay tuned for more stuff, and thank you again for listening and supporting us.